Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the It Depends podcast. I, as always, am your host, Kevin Goldsmith. I am a Chief Technology Officer. I have been a VP of Engineering, a Director of Engineering, a developer for a long time, for over 30 years in the technology industry. And I wrote a book, and it was published in March of this year. The name of the book is called It Depends: Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022. And if this is your first time on the podcast, in this podcast, we serialize the audiobook of the book, a different chapter each episode. In addition to the podcast, there's also a newsletter. The newsletter serializes the text of the book. Both the podcast and the newsletter come out on alternate weeks, and they cover different things. The podcast covers the book in order, and the newsletter covers the book out of order. And so you can subscribe to both. You'll get different content. Eventually, you'll get all the same content, but week to week, you won't. Before we get into chapter, one thing I want to tell you about is I was a guest on the Humanizing Work podcast last week, and that was an absolutely great conversation. I've been a fan of that podcast for a long time and listened to it for quite a while. They cover a lot of Agile stuff. They cover a lot of leadership stuff. I had a really good conversation. I really enjoyed it. So I'll have a link to that in the show notes if you are interested. You can check that out. And in fact, the timing of that was great because that is kind of an Agile podcast. This week's chapter is called Hiring Agile Coaches. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. If you haven't had a chance to actually read the book or buy the book, please do. You can find the more information about the book at itdependsbook.net. And so go please check that out. Really appreciate it. If you are getting value from the content of the podcast or the newsletter, obviously it's all there. What I try and do with the podcast is give you a little bit of director's cut, kind of talk around and give you some background about the chapters, update with some things I'm thinking about these days, but the core of the content is coming from the book. So it is available everywhere, worldwide. You can find it pretty much anywhere. You can get it in hardcover, softcover, audiobook, ebook. It's there for you. I am starting to think about what happens after we cover the book, because we are now on chapter 24 of 36 chapters. So there's 12 more podcasts after this one, and then we'll have finished the book. So I am thinking about what do we do after? Also linked from the show notes is a link to a survey that you can fill out, and it's very quick, and that will just give me some idea of what works for you in this, what isn't working for you, what I may want to do after, that kind of thing. But it's relatively short. And if you would do it, I appreciate it. There is no ads in the podcast except for obviously the book. And so I figure I'm not asking too much of you. You don't have to skip over the ads. So if you don't mind doing that, I would appreciate it. Let's get into this chapter. Nominally, the chapter is about hiring Agile coaches, and I definitely talk about that. I was thinking about this problem a lot because I was hiring Agile coaches, and I talk about my learning about the Agile coach role as opposed to Scrum Master role or kind of program manager-y roles, which would have been my experience before I went to Spotify. Spotify was the first company I've been at that had an Agile coach role. So I talk about my own kind of learning and coming to an understanding of the value of that role. And after I left Spotify and now I'm a CTO and I'm back in the US, that role wasn't a common role in the US. It wasn't an accepted role. I found, certainly in Sweden, but just generally it was more kind of an understood and accepted role in Europe, even 8 years ago. And when I came to the US, it was really not well understood, not very common role. But having learned the value of that role, I really wanted to do that. So my first company where I was CTO was a company called Avo. I hired in Agile coaches, and I have to say, it was incredibly successful. It worked really well and got a lot of the value I wanted to from having that. In later companies, I've had more challenges with the role, partially because I understood it. I brought them in. The teams loved them. They added value, no doubt, no question. But I think at Avo, the particular coaches had done a really good job, or maybe it was me. I don't know. There was something about the people and the time and whatever, where the rest of the organization got to see the value of the coaches and really got excited about them. And we ended up teaching HR Kanban, and the sales team started taking Agile training and got value out of it. So it was really successful. My first kind of time introducing that to a company that had no experience with it. Since then, the coaches have done really well, but they haven't really transcended the engineering team. And that's been a challenge. So I absolutely will credit at least some of the ability for the coaches to kind of transcend the organization at Avo because we were still in the office. So we were 100% in the office. We were all in the same building, literally on different floors of the same building. And so they were very visible, and what they did was very visible. I think some of the challenges I had after at other companies was because we were remote and the coaches were doing good work and were adding value, but that value wasn't visible outside the engineering organization. And I'll say my current role, we have coaches. The coaches, for the first time in the US, the coaches predate me, which is awesome. So I joined a company and there were already coaches there, which was great, and credit to the very forward-thinking folks at the company. So the role is accepted. That's not a challenge in my current role. But in my last company, I brought in the coaches. And again, it was a new role. They established themselves. They're really amazing, great coaches. Did a great job. But the rest of again, fully distributed, the rest of the organization didn't quite understand it, wasn't quite visible. We reached the point where we needed to hire another coach because the existing coaches were really overloaded. And I had to start answering the question, what are these people doing? Like, why do you need this role? And that was a very clear signal. Okay, we're letting you have this, Kevin, but we don't understand it and we're not sure why we need it, as opposed to like another developer or something else. And after I left that role, they got rid of all the coaches really quick, which to me is my failure. Like, I just didn't do a good enough job getting the understanding of the coach role into the company. So if you are hiring coaches, or you are trying to, or you want to hire coaches, one of the things I don't talk about in the chapter because it hadn't happened yet is this idea of having the value of the coaches transcend the engineering organization, making their contributions visible like you would with any role. I think the coach role itself, because the deliverables of the coach role are better performing teams, and you can give that credit to the coaches, but it is generally, if you've never worked in a company with coaches, it's generally assumed like that's what the engineering manager does. Or that's what the product manager or program manager does. And so the idea of having this new role work on it is very foreign to people, and it seems like an extravagance. And so that was certainly my challenge in my last company. If you're trying to introduce this role, which I think is a very valuable role, it's just something to keep in mind, something that you have to think about, demonstrating the value of this role beyond the engineering team. And just something to think about. One of the things I also wanted to talk about when we got to this chapter, I've been thinking about this a lot, is the current state of Agile. And this chapter is part of a 2-chapter section in the book on Agile. The first sort of iterations of the book I did, there was a lot more content, like it was a much bigger section, because I've been using Agile for 25 years now, before the Agile Manifesto existed. And so it is very much a way I work, is very much a way I think. And I have seen kind of Agile, the introduction of Agile for me, it was the Extreme Programming book, but then the Agile Manifesto and Scrum and Kanban and the kind of growth of Agile the transformation of Agile from being lowercase a Agile to uppercase A Agile, all the certifications, the kind of first backlashes against it, the continuing backlash against it, the continuing kind of transformation. Now we have like fast Agile. We have all these kind of the Spotify models, a scaled Agile framework. You have SAFe. You have all these other kind of attempts. You have McKinsey and Boston Consulting and all these big consulting groups coming in to do your Agile transformations for you. So I've kind of seen the Agile grow up, and Agile's very much under pressure now. And it's interesting because it isn't an entity. There is no Agile entity, governing body, or anything like that. It's a way of working. It's a way of thinking. But Agile's also kind of, honestly, long in the tooth. We haven't yet transcended it. And honestly, my number one question for years to like every Agilist I know, when I bump into them or at a conference or whatever, is I'm really curious, what's next? We have a lot of people that say Agile's bad, and almost all the time, if you dig into it, it's not, they had a very poor implementation of Agile, and they've decided that's what Agile is. They had just a really bad version of Agile kind of thrust upon them, and they hate it. It didn't work very well, and they hated it, and they've decided Agile. They've just written off Agile. There's lots of companies that are very successful with it, but the voices of Agile is bad or Agile doesn't work versus the voices of, no, Agile works great and all these companies are successful with it, that goes back and forth. And I think I hear more anti-Agile rhetoric these days than I hear, pro-Agile. And I think part of it is also, we've kind of reached this stasis. People are trying new things. And one of the strengths of it is iterative. The whole point of it is that you are not fixed. You are trying to continuously improve your practices. But, if you're in a really successful Agile organization, each team is improving their practices themselves, and maybe some good ideas pass between teams and stuff. Sometimes companies will come up with a good way of doing something and they'll share it. But it really is kind of individual teams getting better at it, and each team gets better in a way that's specific to that team. So a lot of the growth and improvement happens in very small places and it's very quiet, versus that period of time where there were like whole new Agile frameworks being released and books and certifications. We're kind of not at that kind of place anymore. And so it does really feel like Agile, capital A Agile, is kind of stuck. And like I said, I've been really focused on, okay, well, I can see that. It's not that Agile, there's anything wrong with it. We absolutely use it. We can continue to use it. But you kind of think, well, all right, we've been doing this for a while. What are we going to do next? Like, what's the next thing? And I have not seen anything at all come up yet. So when people say, we don't want to do Agile sucks or Agile doesn't work, for me, because I started my career in my programming in like 1990, where I started to get paid to write code, and Agile didn't exist. We were using like either cowboy coding and just do stuff and hope it gets done by the deadline, but without a lot of organization or very crummy organization. And then I did basically industrial waterfall development at Microsoft for years. And that didn't work. That wasn't good. That was horrible. It was what needed to be done, and it was the way they knew how to make software, but it wasn't a good way to write software. It was a good way to deliver software to a date, but honestly, Microsoft was the best at it, but it wasn't very good at it. It's not like it was great. It's just, it worked. Like the tape out happened when it needed to. So Agile came, it was a revelation, certainly for me, having kind of lived in probably the best waterfall company in the world where it really didn't work very well. And now we have this completely new way of working, and it's a lot more iterative, and you're learning, and it was great. And then we've done that for 25 years. And I'm wondering what's next. Like, is there new things? And it may be also because Agile isn't a one way of doing things. It's really a mindset. So maybe the future is just Agile. And we just continue to each company, each team, maybe start with Scrum, maybe start with XP or whatever as your starting point, and then you just evolve. And eventually what you evolve to, and in the companies I've been in, where the best Agile companies I've worked in, what you end up with doesn't really look like any specific framework. It's you steal this idea from XP and this idea from Kanban and this idea from Scrum, and you also generate your own ways of doing things. And eventually it doesn't look like any of these particular things, but it works real well for the team, and the team's delivering consistently, delivering at high quality, delivering at high velocity, and just doing the thing that makes sense for them. So maybe because of that nature of it, it'll last forever. I doubt it, but I'm still waiting. And so I don't have an answer to that question. What's next? If I was trying to be more of a consultant or write a lot more books, I would just go and try and invent it and kind of force it onto my current company. But I'm not going to do that, because that's not the last thing I need is to be building certifications in a framework I made up. But I am really interested. If you think you've seen the future, and when I say think you've seen the future, I don't mean read a blog post about it or have thought about it, but actually used it to build product, right? Because every idea is great until you actually try and use it to do something for real. But if your company is doing something like you think is really a new approach, a different approach, that there's some intellectual rigor behind. When I say intellectual rigor, I don't mean like you've done case studies with the university or something. I mean like you've thought about it, like there's a deliberate decisions behind it. Please reach out to me, because I'm always on the lookout. What's next? Where are we going? That's part of what I need to do as a CTO. But it's also partly I'm super interested. I'm really interested in finding new and better ways of working. So if you're aware of something, please reach out. And coming back to this chapter, I do talk a little bit about my kind of introduction to Agile, my understanding of the Agile coach. I do want to talk really quickly before we get into the chapter. The chapter is about hiring Agile coaches, which I have done for years and years now. These things that I call out, the things that you should look out for, these aren't things I made up. These are things I encountered. And when I'm hiring again, it's things I still encounter. I talk about why the role of an Agile professional is actually a very difficult one. It's a difficult job. It's not a difficult job because the job itself is difficult. It's a difficult job because, again, companies don't quite understand it and understand the value of it. So where I live in the Pacific Northwest, there's a major telecommunications company. There's multiple ones here, so you won't know which one I mean. But there's a major telecommunications company that any resume from any Agile person I see from this region, they have spent 6 or 12 months at that company. And the reason is that company has been on a 1-year, I talk about this idea of year X of a 1-year Agile transformation. That company has been on an Agile transformation journey for like 10 years. And they start it, they bring in a bunch of consultants, and usually like individual kind of Agile Scrum Masters and Agile coaches or whatever, bring them in, try and do it for like a year. Some executive says, this isn't working at all. They fire all of them. And then a year later, somebody else goes, no, we like this, the way we're working isn't working. We really need to be Agile. And they do the whole thing again. That is specific to this region, that company. But if you start looking for Agile coaches, what you'll probably see in your region or a specific region, you will start to see that like everybody's worked at this company. You'll start going, well, that's really weird. Why have all these people spent 6 months at this company? When you see that, that's why. But it really is like a lot of Agile coaches, especially in the US. It's not as common in Europe. In Europe, you see coaches that have spent years at companies. In the US, just again, because the role is still evolving. And during economic times like this, these are unfortunately a lot of times the first people that if you need to lay off, these people look expendable, especially outside the engineering team, unfortunately, because again, we haven't done a good job communicating the value of this role beyond the team. So a lot of times this is the first role that gets cut, which is unfortunate. But you'll see a lot of people who've done like either just string of consulting gigs or 3-6 month year contracts. I've seen that just create this consultant mindset. And that consultant mindset is all about getting in quick wins. And if you're not expecting to make it past a year, like all you're just trying to do is get the quick wins because you're trying to hopefully justify extending your contract. But it isn't necessarily the way to build a long-term kind of very successful program or successful transformation. So I talk about that in the chapter, just stuff I wanted to augment beyond what I said. I think I cover pretty well the different things to look for. I would say, so I wrote this a few years ago. It's still pretty evergreen to me, having reread it right, before this podcast recording. Still fairly evergreen, still pretty happy with it. I think the advice is still good. Certainly the times have changed in that we're in a downturn. It may mean that you can find, like I said, oftentimes coaches are the first ones, or scrum masters or whatever are the first ones to be reduced in a reduction in force. So there's lots of good people on the market. And if you're thinking about how do I not only improve our practices, but how do we improve how we deliver, it is absolutely the responsibility of engineering leadership. No doubt, like it's my job. If you're an engineering manager, it's your job. It is our jobs, but that doesn't mean we have to do it alone. And that doesn't mean there's only one way to do it. And so it is certainly part of our responsibilities. If you can bring an extra set of eyes without a set of eyes without that positional authority. You have positional authority. People do what you say because you control their salary. You hire them, you fire them, you control their salary. Having an extra set of eyes, another person in the team that's kind of bringing an outside perspective, whose whole focus is just working on improved delivery. It is a little bit of a luxury, but I have absolutely sacrificed other roles to bring that capability in because my own experience, and if you haven't had the experience, it's a challenge because you have to justify, should I bring in a developer or a coach, right? A developer is going to generate lines of code, a coach is going to do what? But a coach is going to make all the other developers more productive. So I'm going to make a little bit of a plea for the role. I will hire coaches forever. And I will absolutely sacrifice an engineer role for a coach role if I think the organization's in a place where a coach could, I hate 10x because it gets misused around, but a coach can often 10x an organization versus a single developer can just generate more code. It's just something to think about. So if you haven't tried it, it's worth considering. Go talk to some coaches, and you can always bring them in on contract to start and see what they can do. But a short-term engagement, a 6-month thing, is going to give you some benefit. You could maybe up-level some practices a little bit, but it is really a long-term role if you can justify it. So now we present chapter 24 of It Depends, Writing on Technology Leadership 2012 to 2022, Hiring Agile Coaches. Hiring Agile Coaches, originally published on June 22nd, 2020. This tweet from Dave Nicolette inspired me to discuss what I look for when hiring Agile professionals. Here I quote the tweet. Has anyone found that Agile coaches are very good at describing an ideal end state and less good at finding a path from present-day reality to that end state? Asking for a friend. Understanding the value of Agile coaches. While I've been working exclusively with Agile techniques since we adopted extreme programming at a startup where I was the development lead in 2000, I had never encountered a team-aligned full-time Agile professional before I joined Spotify in 2013. My prior experience with Agile was always that the team was responsible for it. As a development lead, I was the XP coach when we adopted extreme programming. When my teams chose Scrum, I might take the role of the Scrum Master, or it was the program manager, someone else on the team, or float between multiple people. When I came to Spotify and found that I had 3 Agile coaches in my tribe, I was first a bit skeptical about the role. The coaches I worked with were not program managers, not Scrum Masters. They didn't lead Agile in the teams with whom they worked. I wasn't sure what their purpose was. I first understood their value when one of them went on an extended vacation a few months after I started. At Spotify, I found the most advanced and mature implementation of Agile and Lean product development at a scale I'd never seen. I knew the coaches helped with this, but I wasn't sure how. The coach went on their vacation, and everything kept going on as usual for a while. I would visit the stand-ups, and teams added stories and track them across the boards. One day I sat in on a squad stand-up and noticed that they'd added a couple of swim lanes to their Kanban board. They now had more swim lanes than developers, a big red flag. Over the weeks the coach was gone, the team slowly slid into bad habits. Velocity started to slip. I did my best to make them aware of this and get them back onto better paths, but I couldn't be with each team enough. The coach returned from vacation, and within a week or so, things were back to their high levels of performance. I wanted to see how he did it, so I watched the ceremonies when I could. He didn't cajole or quote Agile texts at them. He gently reminded them what good looked like, lessons they had learned in the past. He asked them questions about their approach. He didn't fix them. He got them to fix themselves. A true coach. Now I understood the value of the Agile coach role. Good coach, bad coach. As Spotify grew and the number of Agile coaches in the company swelled, I also saw some challenges with the role. Some coaches were highly effective and some less so. I was lucky to start with 3 excellent coaches on my team. Some of my peers struggled with the coaches in their organizations. As I came to understand the characteristics of the coaches that I found successful, I started to look for those qualities as we hired into our team. I've continued to look for those qualities as I've created those roles at companies in the US and the UK, where the role of Agile coach versus Scrum Master, Delivery Manager, or Agile Project Manager is still novel. Before I enumerate those characteristics, I want to make one point about careers as an Agile professional. It is a tough job. In many parts of the world, full-time Agile roles are very hard to come by. Mostly, companies hire Agile folks on a contractual basis. So, most Agile people must string together 6 or 12-month stints at various companies to earn a living. After reviewing hundreds of US and European resumes, the same companies show up often. These companies are always the ones who are in year X of a 1-year Agile transformation program. Those are soul-crushing gigs. The stringing together of short-term jobs can lead to a consultant mindset. These folks have the wisdom from jumping into hostile environments trying to survive. They have seen many mistakes that companies have made. Few have held the more extended roles where they have not only got teams functioning in an Agile way, but also helped them to evolve to a much better level. Their experience is broad, but not deep. It is vital to keep that in mind as you review applicants. You must understand their world and watch out for folks stuck in that short-term mindset. What I look for when I hire Agile coaches. A product development background. It isn't critical which specific history the person has as a developer, tester, product manager, UX designer, engineering manager. I just want to see that they had direct experience shipping a product. Agile roles have been around long enough that there are now schools that train them, and then they go right into the profession. From my experience, Agile people without experience building products can have difficulty making the sometimes necessary trade-offs. They may focus too much on the how without understanding the why, what, or when. Broad knowledge of Agile frameworks and techniques. While the core of Agile thinking has existed for many years, new practices and methods continue to evolve. Like any profession, I look for a candidate to demonstrate that they are not only keeping up, but are interested with what is happening in their field. Experience growing a team's proficiency over time. As mentioned above, many Agile professionals get stuck in an endless series of Agile transformations at different companies. While this is a valuable experience for an Agile consultant, it isn't practical for someone in a long-term role. Pragmatic, not pedantic. Pragmatism is something I look for in everyone I hire. I would not expect this to be an issue for an Agile professional, but I have interviewed people whose definition of what was or was not correct was defined by a single book. Knowing what good Agile looks like. The characteristics of a high-performing Agile team are incredibly context-dependent. There is no single way to be an effective team. So how do you convince teams to invest in improvement? You need to give them a vision of what they can be, meaning you need to know what good looks like. Knowing what bad looks like. The converse of knowing what good looks like is knowing what bad looks like. I want to hear what the candidate identifies as harmful patterns in a team. The patterns they identify help me understand how they look at teams. I also want to listen to their techniques for breaking teams out of these patterns. I want to hear what has worked and not worked for them. A desire to build something bigger than themselves. I want to see some ambition in a coach. Not just to get a group working well, but to redefine what a group can achieve with the proper support. If a candidate thinks their job is complete when the team has regular ceremonies, a groomed backlog, and a good flow of tickets, they probably aren't what I'm looking for. Experience working with cross-functional stakeholders. Too many people view Agile as a software development thing, with defined boundaries aligned to the engineering team. Successful Agile organizations interface with the whole company, even if those functions do not choose to work in an Agile way. Building an Agile coaching practice in your organization. If you want to develop a new Agile coaching practice within your organization, it is best to start slow. Hire one coach and work with them to establish what the role means within your company. When the organization demands more time from them than they have to give, it will be time to hire a second coach, and so on. Each coach should be able to support multiple teams, especially if you want the teams to own their practices instead of the coach. This is one reason why the coach should not be the Scrum Master for the groups they work with. Working with multiple groups also helps give some visibility across the organization about the quality of Agile practices and is an excellent conduit for best practice sharing. You may have overhired coaches when the Agile coaches start to drive their own deliverables and organize their work as a function. That may mean the coach-to-team ratio is off. If you are serious about evolving your Agile practice as an organization and improving your team's quality, efficiency, and happiness, hire an Agile coach. But make sure you hire the right one. Hey, as always, I hope you got some value from the chapter, made you maybe think a little bit differently about it. I will say, actually, this chapter was already serialized in the newsletter. I will include a link to that newsletter issue in the show notes. I will also, again, make a plea to please do the survey. There's a link to that in the show notes as well. If you have questions, if you have comments, please just reach out, contact@itdependsbook.net. And I will see you next week in the newsletter and then in 2 weeks back here on the podcast. Have a great week. Thanks so much for listening. Please, again, subscribe, rate, share episodes of this podcast on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for Answers to April for the music used in this podcast. To hear more from Answers to April, visit answerstoapril.com. This podcast is a production of Unit Circle Media.